Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most wild and devastating chain reactions in human history, the triggers of World War I. Think about it for a second. How exactly did decades of simmering tension, coupled with one single localized murder, ignite a fire that practically burned the whole world down? Let's get right into it.
It really all comes down to this staggering question: how does one assassination drag the entire planet into war? On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, the Archduke was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and this happened in the city of Sarajevo. And yeah, while it was absolutely a shocking event, you might be wondering, okay, but how does a political murder in southeastern Europe lead to a global catastrophe? Well, it's because this single event acted as the violent match that finally lit Europe's massive powder keg.
So, to really understand the underlying causes of the war, we have to zoom out for a minute. We need to look at how Europe had slowly become this incredibly tightly wound spring. Because the explosive conditions that started World War I, they didn't just happen overnight. They actually took decades to build up.
When looking at the causes of WWI, historians use this absolutely brilliant acronym, literally the word MAIN, to break down the four long-term, interconnected pressures that push the continent right to the edge. We're talking militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Understanding these four pillars is basically the master key to unlocking why the war broke out in the first place. Let's briefly break each of these down.
First up, the M, militarism. Back then, the major powers, especially Great Britain and Germany, were locked in this massive, highly dangerous arms race. By the early 20th century, these nations were building standing armies of unprecedented size, and they were rapidly expanding their navies. They were pumping out these massive, incredibly powerful new dreadnought battleships. It was a total flex of military muscle. And as these militaries grew to staggering sizes, military leaders started gaining immense political power. War wasn't just seen as a last resort anymore. For a lot of these leaders, it was actually viewed as this glorious, almost inevitable way to just settle international scores once and for all.
Then we have the A, which stands for alliances. To protect themselves in this hyper-militarized environment, countries started forming these incredibly complex and often totally secret mutual defense treaties. The logic seemed simple, but it was deeply, deeply flawed. The rule was basically, if one nation gets attacked, its allies are legally bound to step in and defend it. But because of these overlapping treaties, there were practically zero fail-safes. A conflict between just two countries was almost 100% guaranteed to activate this entire hitting network and drag the rest of the continent into the fight. It was essentially a continent-wide tripwire.
Next is the I, imperialism. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were all about this fierce, cutthroat competition for global wealth, natural resources, and colonial territory. Things like the scramble for Africa and the intense race for colonies in Asia created some really bitter international rivalries. You had nations like Britain and France who already controlled these sprawling global empires. But then you had Germany. They industrialized a bit later and felt totally boxed out of the global wealth pie. This fierce economic and territorial competition pushed diplomatic tensions to the absolute breaking point.
And finally, the N, nationalism. This was an era defined by an intense, aggressive pride in one's own nation or ethnic group, surging right alongside this powerful desire for self-determination. And this pressure cooker? It was easily the most volatile in the Balkans down in southeastern Europe. Over there, various Slavic groups harbored some deep, very real resentments against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ruled over a lot of them. These groups fiercely sought independence, and crucially, they were heavily backed by Russia, who saw themselves as the big protector of their shared Slavic heritage.
And what we are looking at here brilliantly illustrates the geographic reality of exactly what we just talked about. By 1914, Europe was effectively sandwiched and split into two rigid, heavily armed camps right before the war. You can literally see the sweeping division across the continent. It locked these massive empires into a high-stakes staring contest, where blinking basically meant total war. So, let's look at exactly who was in those two camps. On one side, you had the Triple Entente. That was Britain, France, and Russia. And squared off directly against them was the Triple Alliance, made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So with these rigid alliances set in stone and these massive armies primed and ready to go, the stage was perfectly set. The whole continent was basically drenched in gasoline. All it needed was a single spark.
Which brings us to the July crisis and how the dominoes finally fell. This is where that incredibly fragile web of alliances we just talked about snapped tight over just a few short weeks.
Seriously, look at how insanely fast this escalates. June 28th, Gavrilo Princip assassinates the Archduke. Then, backed by a famous blank check of unconditional support from Germany, Austria-Hungary issues this intentionally impossible ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd. When Serbia inevitably rejects part of it, the trap springs. July 28th, Austria-Hungary officially declares war, and bam, the dominoes start toppling. July 30th, Russia mobilizes its giant army to defend Serbia. Then Germany panics, declaring war on Russia on August 1st, and then France just 2 days later. To bypass French defenses, Germany invades neutral Belgium, which instantly forces Great Britain into the fight on August 4th. In literally just over a month, the entire world was at war.
If you take away just one key insight from this explainer today, let it be this. The war wasn't caused simply by one isolated event. Yes, the assassination was the spark, absolutely, but it was a complete systemic failure of complex mutual defense treaties that transformed a localized Balkan dispute into a global catastrophe. Those rigid MAIN causes basically ensured that once that first shot was fired, the rest of the continent literally had no choice but to follow suit.
Which leaves us with a pretty chilling thought to wrap up on. Those combined forces successfully shattered the entire Old World Order, but as millions of young men marched off in August of 1914, heavily influenced by militaristic propaganda, fully expecting a quick, glorious victory, how quickly do you think they realized they had just stepped into the brutal, grinding reality of modern trench warfare? It's a sobering reminder of how interconnected systems and escalating tensions can spiral entirely out of human control. Thanks for exploring this incredibly impactful history with me today.